Skonson production.
Ciao, zdravo, wagwan, Balkan family, Skonson family. Shout out to everybody locked inside right now from the Balkans. We appreciate you on this 3-part special.
Težina, lanaca. We're not going to waste no more time. We're just going to get straight back into it, guys. Let's go.
Godina I tu se zaustavila.
Instead of building peaceful and trusting relationships between the warring sides in Croatia, in 1992, the Pentagon was too busy proclaiming its imperial hegemony over the world in its defense planning guide. According to the New York Times of 1992, this document asserts that the only possible course for the US to pursue is complete world domination, and it adds that no other country has the right to aspire to the role of leadership, even as a regional power.
It's simply looked upon itself now as the supreme power in a unipolar world, and that they could do whatever they wanted to do.
Yugoslavia had to be broken down, and there was no better symbol for Yugoslavia than its Central Republic of Bosnia. War erupted into the worst bloodbath in Europe since World War II.
Civil War.
Have so much bloodshed and loss.
Civil War is the worst kind of war. It involves brother versus brother, family member versus family member, and it is one of the ugliest kind of conflicts.
No.
The Serbs wanted to have control over the lands mainly inhabited by Serbs, including lands that were of a strategic importance to them. The Croats wanted the same for themselves, while the Bosnian Muslims, or Bosniaks as they're called today, wanted it all. To achieve this, the Bosnian government, now increasingly representing the Bosniak voice, started getting help from the Americans.
The secret flights started arriving at Tuzla. The Americans started to approve the delivery of arms to the Bosnian Muslims.
American President Clinton later admitted in a book that the Americans didn't enforce the arms embargo. Who can say no to these guys? Serbs, on the other hand, relied heavily on aid from Belgrade. As the Yugoslav army was the 4th largest in Europe, the West moved to stop Belgrade from helping the Serbs in Bosnia. So, in May of 1992, sanctions were imposed on what was left of Yugoslavia, Serbia and Montenegro. By October 1993, 90% of Yugoslavia's domestic drug production stopped. The average daily intake of calories had fallen by 28% compared to 1990, and 1.5 million people were classified as undernourished. 2 months later, over 60% of Yugoslavia's workforce was unemployed, and the average monthly income had dropped from $500 to $15. The markets and stores were close to empty.
Nema mesa, nema lekova, nema ulja, nema beli sijalica, evo molim svi.
You know what it is? It's the sheer quickness, brzo, that it happened. It's the sheer it's just almost like that. Like if it happens over a span of, I don't know, 30 years, you're like eased into it. But what? 1, 2.
It's like from like 1989, just like bang.
As usual, sanctions and merely hurt the people at the lowest rung on the ladder. People at the top benefit from them.
They forced the Serbs into what would happen anywhere. It was a criminal economy. The criminals became the king because we made it so.
If you go to Belgrade, what used to be the diplomatic areas are now all the thugs and goons that made tons of money from the war on the black market. More profiteers. Big time.
Slobo's government hijacked the country's financial system, while Serbia's citizens were duped by several pyramid schemes, most notably by those of Dafina Milanović.
Izuzetno pametan narod. Ja sam donela odluku da svi oni koji žive od Dafimin banke I dalje žive.
Narod, želite li bolji život? Želite li posao? Želite li penzije na vreme? Želite li vašu staru deviznu štednju? Ja to umem I mogu da ostvarim.
For themselves, of course, because both Defina and Jezza got the hell out of the country with the people's money. The economic tragedy, triggered by the sanctions, was reaching its peak.
The effect was quite severe, especially in 1993. Actually, the inflation rate in Yugoslavia was the highest in recorded history. So, as I recall, I think it was something like 1.8 billion% inflation rate.
They even printed a 500 billion dinar note. The lawlessness was intensifying and the mafia was taking control. In spite of the catastrophe around them, the Serbs would not yield to the will of the West. So one man decided to use this opportunity to save an organization that no longer had a purpose. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, was a system of collective defense whereby its member states agreed to mutual defense in response to an attack by any external party.
We know what's coming here.
Yeah, boy.
Founded in 1949. The purpose, really, became to protect the West from the Soviets, a counterbalance to the later formed Warsaw Pact.
President Eisenhower saw NATO as a defensive alliance that eventually the Europeans would take over. Instead, the U.S. has turned it into an instrument of power and eastward expansion.
But then the Soviet Union went bust.
The U.S. explicitly broke the agreement that was made with Gorbachev about not surrounding Russia with hostile, militarily armed states.
The colonization of Serbia is the bottom or second step on the staircase to Russia. We must be colonized because NATO learned Hitler's lesson. Don't have a two-front war when you're attacking the Russians. You have to neutralize Yugoslavia the way Hitler did.
But to do that, you'd need to create a case where you had to intervene against an enemy in Yugoslavia. Enter Joe Biden.
We face a blatant act of Serbian expansionism and aggression. This is no more a civil war than Germany and Austria and Czechoslovakia had civil wars in the 1930s. This, as then in my view, is fascist thuggery on the march.
Look how clear spoken he is there compared to now. He's like, yeah. Do you know what I mean?
He was calling Serbs horrific names at the same time that he had a very influential position on the Foreign Relations Committee of the Senate.
Biden was also emphasizing the importance of a new role.
See all them man there. All of them man there. You can even see it. I don't know if you see the same, but you see when he's talking there, you can see the evil in him when he's talking. All them man have blood on their hands. Big blood on their hands.
They go to sleep at night like it's
I don't know how they sleep at night, bro. I don't know how they sleep at night. Man, I can hardly sleep.
If you've like wronged someone.
Yeah.
Goes to show you, man, these guys in power, cold-hearted motherfuckers, man.
Soulless.
Role for NATO, as seen in February of 1994 at the Senate hearing on the future of NATO.
Last month, while the Allies reassured themselves in Brussels that NATO remains at the bedrock of European security, crimes of a kind that were tried in Nuremberg a half a century ago continued unabated in Bosnia. Without a common enemy to unite us, we may find that our conceptions of what constitutes national interest may very well divide us.
He found the common enemy in the Serbian people, who were already previously demonized by U.S. public relation firms such as Ruder and Finn, hired by various separatist groups from Yugoslavia.
They not only demonized the Serbian leadership, they demonized the Serbian people.
The problem for the Serbs was that they were a little slow off the mark. They did not understand what was being done to them, and by the time they did, the whole Balkan region had collapsed into a state of conflict in which the Serbs were made out clearly from propaganda at the time to be the enemy of everybody else.
Thus, the U.S. quickly set out to act against the Serbs, stirring up a storm in Croatia. Operation Storm, that is.
So they came up with a plan where the Croatian army would launch an attack down into the Krajina and occupy the area that was manned by the Serbian minority that had been there for, 4 or 5 centuries. But it was declared that they were much too radical to permit to continue within the borders of Croatia.
And at a meeting on the Brijuni Islands, Franjo gave his go-ahead to General Ante Gotovina for the largest single act of ethnic cleansing during the Yugoslav wars.
Da nanesemo takve udarce da Srbi praktično nestanu. Jer tu je važno slušati da i ti civili, znate, da pođu, pa će onda i vojske, tako da kad pođu kolone, to djeluje psihološki jedni na druge. Znači, na taj način im dati put, a jamčiti tobože građanska prašpa i tako da.
An operation that lasted 84 hours in August of 1995 resulted in the death of around 2,000 and a quarter of a million ethnically cleansed Serbs. Slobo and his generals, the protectors of all Serbs, had abandoned them.
Šta da radimo? Spasavajte se kako znam. 2,000 in 84 hours. Yeah.
Operation Storm, which was an American inspired by some of my colleagues, because the people that were advising the Croatian army were retired American general officers and who operate just outside the Beltway in Washington.
Franjo was very happy.
Nisu imali vremena da pokupili svoje prljave pare devize niti gaće.
With the Serbs gone from Croatia, the Americans moved on to Bosnia. Simply pushing out the Serbs from there was not so easy, so a different strategy was implemented. Presenting the conflict in Bosnia as a civil war, which it was, instead of a war of Serbian aggression, meant that the Western public would be confused and the water would be muddied. To intervene, the Americans needed to make it clear who they had to intervene against.
The Serbs started this war. The Serbs are the original cause of the war.
They are the complete aggressors and wrongdoers.
NATO was used to militarily continue the colonization process, but Clinton knew it had to be somehow justified to the wider public. Perhaps the best example of what we're talking about here is Srebrenica. Srebrenica, a village in Bosnia, was declared a UN safe zone for Bosniaks seeking refuge, but was never really demilitarized, which allowed Bosniak forces to attack neighboring Serb villages. Serb commander Ratko Mladic overran Srebrenica, with thousands of Muslims killed and ethnically cleansed.
What happened in Srebrenica was a stage-managed fall of the enclave to the Serbian forces, which never expected to conquer it.
The United Nations declared that this was genocide, even though UN observer Philip Corwin estimated that the number of killed Muslims in Srebrenica was no larger than the number of Serbs killed in villages around Srebrenica. But that didn't matter. Srebrenica was to be used for a much greater agenda.
There are trustworthy witnesses on the Muslim side who claim that Ali Izetbegovic told them that Bill Clinton had indicated to him, Izetbegovic, that 5,000 dead Muslims would be the price of NATO intervention on the Bosnian Muslim side. They believe that Srebrenica was deliberately sacrificed by Izetbegovic in order to provide this burnt offering to the White House that would be the justification for intervention, and indeed the proof of the pudding is indeed.
The Bosnia government had no choice.
Mr. Salajic, speaking for his government, said,
"We have no choice, and our presidency had no choice but to appeal for a military intervention in Bosnia and Herzegovina.
You cannot go this alone. The American public will not tolerate it. The alliance cannot stand it."
I just, whenever any of them American leader man talk, I'm just like, bro, I could never ever watch the news and believe anything anyone says to me. You know that? I don't care what it's about. Sorry.
And intervention ensued. Here was NATO, an organization formed for the sole purpose of defense of its member states, attacking a country that has not attacked or threatened any of its member states. Louis Mackenzie, who was the Major General of the UN Army in charge of Sector Sarajevo, tried to warn the Americans of what they were embarking upon.
So I appeared in front of Congress and they asked me my opinion, and I said, start training your grandchildren to be peacekeepers in Bosnia, because you're going to be there for generations. And a lot of them are still there.
As heavily armed US and NATO troops enforced the peace in Bosnia, the press and politicians alike portrayed Western intervention in the former Yugoslavia as a noble, if agonizingly belated response to an outbreak of ethnic massacres and human rights violations.
A lot of the so-called liberal or left-wing or progressive media were themselves co-opted by the mainstream viewpoint regarding the Balkans. In other words, they had bought into this paradigm that was presented to them by the arms of the government of the United States and the EU powers.
Only the journalists who towed the line and found new ways to attack the Serbs, other than the ones that their editors sent them to tell, other than the stories that were pre-written before they came to the Balkans, those guys excelled.
Of course, the bombing campaign forced the Bosnian Serbs to surrender. At the peace accord signing, which internally divided Bosnia into a Serb entity and a Muslim Croat entity, all those responsible for intensifying the war were praising peace. This is the village of Vrbarje, near Sokolac in Bosnia, inhabited mainly by Serbs and Muslims. After the imposed Dayton peace accords, the villagers were aware of what this meant to them. And as the town became part of the Serb entity, the Muslims decided to collectively leave to their own entity.
Eto vas uplakani oba komšije.
Ja.
Danas se rastajete.
Da, kao tako.
Pa je vam teško?
Kako vidite.
Jel ovo baš lijepo da se komšije...
Look at the emotion, bruv.
Yeah, man.
Look at the emotion. I just want to take this time to say, I love all my Bosnians. I love all my Serbs. I love all my Croatians. And I love all... everyone, man.
Yeah.
Simple as that.
Komšije rastaju u suzama.
Ovo je sa svega srca, mog i njegovog. Sigurno.
Živjeli ste toliko godina.
Koliko imamo godina, toliko smo živjeli. Živjeli smo.
Bez svađe, bez nesuglasica.
Ne bez svađe, ne bez suglasica, nego sa pomoći jedan drugom. Čitavog života do sada je bilo i evo sada je tako.
Kako je sad? Kako vam je sad?
Teško.
Recite po srcu i duši, je li bilo maltretiranja, je li vam bilo ovdje loše?
Nikad. Nije nam moglo bolje biti.
Je li vam žao?
Pa još nam žao rastaviti se s našim komšijama, oni su nama uvijek valjali, dobri smo bili, slagali se, sve.
Jesu vas provocirala djeca, jer ste imali nikakvih problema ovdje, srpska djeca?
Nije ništa, sve smo bili fino, koji ranije što smo bili.
This video footage has never been shown anywhere before. It just didn't fit the image that the Western media had tried so hard to project, the tidy melodrama of the evil Serbs destroying everything non-Serb in sight. Do you think this would mobilize Western public opinion to intervene?
Nije bilo svađa, nije bilo pritisaka, nije bilo tuča, nije bilo.
Nikad.
Živi ste i zdravi?
Živi i zdravi, nismo imali problema, ni najmanji problem nisam imala. Svi su mi dolazili, i vojnici, i narod drugi, nikad me nije niko vala, ni krivo pogledao, Boga mi.
What? Serbs not behaving like genocidal maniacs?
Komšija nam evo došla, evo 2 dana, uvijek imam nekoga od komšija, prate nas, plaćemo svi. Tako.
Rastajemo
se kao ljudi.
Human beings? Them?
I volio da se sredi ovo, da mi opet i dalje zajednički živimo kao što smo živjeli, da dođe jedno vrijeme, da bude Jugoslavija kao što je bila.
Bruv, listen.
Human compassion was something that was completely normal to a young Serbian man from Trebinje in Herzegovina called Srđan Aleksić. Srđan's father recalled how his son noticed that the Serb police was arresting a man on an ethnic basis.
Srđan je vidio da policajci vode Alena, pošao je za njima da vidi šta je razlog što ga vode. Dogodilo se da su naišli na pijanog vojnika koji je oteo Alena iz ruku policajaca kada je shvatio da je ovaj musliman. Ovaj vojnik je izvadio nož da zakolje Alena na ulici kao na najgrublji način što se može oduzeti čovjeku život. Srđan se umiješao, pohrvao se s vojnikom, Alen se skočio, pobjegao Srđan je izbio nož vojniku iz ruka i pošao da ide, ali su naišla još trojica vojnika koja su izdaleka vidjeli da Srđan hrve sa vojnikom. Napali su Srđana, oborili ga, gazili ga nogama, udarali. Srđan je ostao na ulici unesvješćen, vojnici su otišli kao obavili su svoj posao i živjeli se na čovjekom. Srđan je prevezen u bolnicu, konstatovan izliv krvi na mozak. 7 dana se Srđan borio za opstanak. Za život. 7. dan, na sami dan 27. januara 1993. godine je Srđan umro.
This is one among many stories of true heroism that never made it to the Western media. The West was more focused on escalating the conflict so they could have the excuse for jumping in for their own interests. As the world celebrated peace in Bosnia, the international financial institutions were busily collecting former Yugoslavia's external debt from its remnant states, while transforming the Balkans into a safe haven for free enterprise. In late 1995, the West unveiled a reconstruction program that stripped Bosnia of sovereignty to a degree not seen in Europe since the end of World War II. It was pure colonialism, consisted largely of making Bosnia a divided territory under NATO military occupation and foreign administration. This pattern of intervention was so successful that the West just had to replicate it in Kosovo.
But I think that the region is very important in geostrategic terms, and they saw Kosovo as a very potential country to actually secure their presence in the region.
But the West underestimated the importance that Kosovo has to the Serbian people.
My fellow Americans, today our armed forces joined our NATO allies in airstrikes against Serbian forces responsible for the brutality in Kosovo.
On March 24th, 1999, on the order of Javier Solana, in an act of pure aggression, NATO had violated international law and the UN Charter by launching an air assault on Yugoslavia. The people of Yugoslavia, however, decided to show their true spirit by going outside, singing songs and having fun on their bridges in spite of the catastrophe around them.
Pre nekoliko sati proglašena vazdušna opasnost.
Da, i baš me briga. Clintone, i pobedit će.
Hoću da kažem da je Clinton žena i nema srce, nema milost i šta mu jebem. Izvinjavam se. Ako ovaj most bude srušen, mi ćemo ga napravimo za 3 sata. Jer tako smo u mogućnosti.
We thought the Serbs should last 5 days under the bombing, and then, no one expected them to run under bridges and put on Target t-shirts.
The declared mission was to stop the violence in Kosovo and topple Slobo. Bombing Yugoslavia had the opposite effect, as the conflict in Kosovo only intensified and the public rallied behind Slobo. The reality of the war, however, was far too gruesome. Schools, hospitals, bridges, TV stations, and even foreign embassies were all legitimate military targets for NATO.
The things that they bombed, the power grid, and night after night they would hit the power grid, knock it out so that they couldn't pump water and they couldn't, the bakeries couldn't fire up in Belgrade, so denying millions of people access to daily bread and water.
Bro, that's mad. Guys, what is that song playing in the background? Because that sounded nice.
The bakeries couldn't fire up in Belgrade, so denying millions of people access to daily bread and water. How does that affect the counterinsurgency efforts of the Serbian security forces in the province of Kosovo?
These were attacks on the Serbian people.
When civilians died, they call them, collateral damages, and that's what, makes you feel bad, because humans, they have their names and they're everything for their families, but for the rest of the world, they're just collateral damage.
They hit the cigarette factory in Niš 3 times. And it ended up being purchased by Philip Morris. Well, if I walk into a supermarket with a hammer and start smashing stuff and then say, look, I'll pay you a pittance for the remains, I'm a Viking or a Vandal.
Apparently, the cigarettes made in Niš were also killing Albanians in Kosovo, so they needed to be taken out.
Obviously, Philip Morris had an issue with the cigarette factory in Niš. It was one of their main competitors in the European market.
The real purpose of the war was to economically colonize the country, to replace the entire non-compatible domestic infrastructure with German-compatible, American-compatible economic systems. So bomb The car factory, the Yugo car factory, the car that managed to make it into the U.S. market.
The Yugo, it's the road back to sanity.
Bomb that to the ground. Bomb the cement factories, bomb the oil industry, bomb all of the telecommunication systems, so you can sell them the new ones much more expensive, not any better.
If this was NATO's job, it had to have been well coordinated in advance. In fact, almost a year prior to the war, the World Bank carefully analyzed the consequences of an eventual military intervention leading to the occupation of Kosovo, and conducted relevant simulations which anticipated the possibility of an emergency scenario arising out of the tensions in Kosovo. This
my days.
Suggests that NATO had already briefed the World Bank at an early stage of military planning. The plans for occupation started before a good enough pretext to intervene was found. But hold on, occupation? Weren't we told that Kosovo was to be liberated from the Serbian aggressors who invaded it? Well, I have yet to find someone who can explain how a country can invade itself. History was twisted in a way that would give the West a believable pretext to intervene. After 5 centuries of Turkish rule, Kosovo legally became a part of Serbia in 1912. By then, a lot of the Serbs were long gone, and those that were left were again under persecution during World War II when the Albanian fascists took over Kosovo. Mustafa Kruja, the Prime Minister of Albania, was in Kosovo in June of 1942, and at a meeting with the Albanian leaders of Kosovo, he said, "We should endeavor to ensure that the Serb population of Kosovo the area be cleansed of them, and all Serbs who had been living there for centuries should be termed colonialists and sent to concentration camps in Albania. The Serb settlers should be killed."
The terror against the indigenous Serbian population reached significant proportions, with over 10,000 being killed in cold blood and twice that number being expelled.
Here's Tito with Enver Hoxha, the Albanian dictator during communist times. You see, one thing I didn't mention about Tito is that he didn't just want to be ruler of Yugoslavia. He wanted most of the Balkans, a federation including parts of Greece and Italy, Bulgaria and Albania as well. This meant that the Albanian dictator Hoxha was to be shown just how much the Albanians were well treated in Yugoslavia. So the Yugoslav Albanians, living mostly in Kosovo, got a better living standard than in Albania. Their own university, schools, newspapers, political institutions, cultural centers, everything in the Albanian language. Albanians from Albania were flooding into Kosovo with ease, and the Serbs were being pushed out.
Ovdje su bili 200 srpskih kuća, sada su svega 5. Sve je to otišlo od terora, od pritiska.
Western media failed to mention any of this. The official story was that Kosovo Albanians wanted independence because of Slobo's actions in the 1990s, which ignored the fact that Albanians demanded for Kosovo the status of a republic quickly after Tito's Yugoslavia was formed, around the time Slobo was born, and even held mass demonstrations in 1968. In 1974, Tito gave Kosovo, still a province of Serbia, all the traits of a republic, and this effectively helped the Albanian leaders to continue what was started in World War II.
You had a lot of low-level intimidation, attacks on individuals that are not dealt with by the police, in the sense that effectively there's no arrests that follow.
A New York Times article published on July 12, 1982, many years before Slobo came to power, said that the exodus of Serbs is admittedly one of the main problems that the authorities have to contend with in Kosovo. Regarding the Albanians who want to separate from Yugoslavia, Beqir Hoti, an executive secretary of the Communist Party of Kosovo, stated that the nationalists have a two-point platform. First, to establish what they call an ethnically clean Albanian republic, and then the merger with Albania to form a greater Albania. And they were desperate for help. They needed it at any cost. Any cost, you say?
Adore you, now and forever. My dreams come true, cause I keep your name. When I grow, I will do for children the same.
There are a lot of little girls in Kosovo whose first name is Madeline.
If you want, we can talk here, we can go outside.
Mr. Clark, this is your group, your KLA, former fighters.
Thank you for the enormous amount of money you've raised.
What are you getting from that? America's doing their slimy little tricks again with Albania.
Yeah, brother.
I must say, undo a thumb. I never expected that anywhere someone would make such a big statue of me.
You gotta hand it to the Albanians. They really know how to flatter the Americans. Trouble is, the Albanians didn't know what they were getting themselves into. In 1998, the KLA was still classified by the US State Department as a terrorist organization bankrolled by the proceeds from the heroin trade and by Osama bin Laden. As it became more evident that the KLA was driving events in Kosovo, the US realized it could use them for their own interests.
The whole northern Albania region was actually under the control of the KLA, not the Albanian government. And US cargo planes were landing at the rate of 2 a day, bringing supplies and arms shipments. British Special Forces, CIA, US military forces were providing training to the KLA. This was before the war. Germany was shipping ex-East German military arms to Albania with the understanding that Albania would provide it to the KLA.
The goal was to provoke a harsh response from the Serbian army so the West could pretend it's jumping in to stop the war and impose its policies. Slobo sent in the military and a full-blown conflict erupted in 1998.
1999. godine je prosto simulirana jedna situacija nerazrešivog konflikta Srbije i Albanaca pod firmom kršenja prava. Ljudska prava su tu poslužila kao mantra preko koje će javno mnjenje Zapada, pre svega Sjedinjenih Američkih Država, da prihvati legitimnost intervencije.
Certainly, everything the United States has done in Afghanistan and Iraq is far worse than what the Serbian military ever did in Kosovo.
If you're going to colonize a territory, you might as well put it on paper. U.S. State Secretary Madeleine Albright masterminded the so-called Rambouillet Agreement, which was modeled on the Dayton Accords imposed on Bosnia. Here, NATO outlined how it will occupy and colonize Yugoslavia in annex.
You see how America, are just masters of this whole propaganda thing and like making themselves seem squeaky clean when.
Bruv, it's mad because you would think after World War II, Germany, a country like Germany, wouldn't be so successful as it is today.
Yeah.
But I can tell you for a fact, all of them German man that they said that they captured and killed, including Hitler and himself, they didn't capture them, bruv. They ended up working for America, man. I tell you, that propaganda stuff was created in Germany first. And America, you know what I mean? They saw the benefits of having a tool like propaganda. Because we still believe propaganda to today, bruv, in 2022.
Yeah.
But I digress.
Enjoy, together with their vehicles, vessels, aircraft, and equipment, free and unrestricted passage and unimpeded access throughout Yugoslavia.
Naravno, oni su nas zato odveli u Rambuje da bi nas udavili.
We intentionally raised the bar too high. We knew that they could not accept this addendum to the agreement, and the intention was to go ahead and bomb.
In fact, this annex was secret. That's right, it was not revealed to the public until several months after the beginning of the war. The document also went a step further and basically promised Kosovo's secession in 3 years.
The Kosovar leaders signed that agreement last week. Even though it does not give them all they want,
nope, they have to wait 3 more years to get it.
They saw that a just peace is better than a long and unwinnable war. The Serbian leaders, on the other hand, refused even to discuss key elements of the peace agreement.
Gee, I wonder why. Hey, do you want us to occupy you this way or that way? Of course, while the true details were hidden, the story was presented that the Americans wanted to protect the Albanians.
Some refugee, maybe we can show some refugee pictures. You know what? They break my heart.
Yes, it's horrifying.
America's been responding to this terror, these pictures that have been going on, and all these atrocities. You look at all the atrocities, all the misery and mayhem and insanity. There's an insidious evil that permeates this earth.
Many Albanians didn't buy it.
Ja sam šitar, nisam prvoslav. Šitar sam, Albanac. Od Prvi svjetski rat i do danas Nigde nisam živio bolje no u Kosovu i u Jugoslaviji. Država koja je najbogatna država u svijet, vidi što radi na zlo u Jugoslaviji i narod jugoslavski.
Woke, he knew, wagwan.
I šiptarsko. To je sve kriva od Učekehi, od Ameriku, od NATO.
Ali oni tvrde kako pomažu Albancima, sprečavaju humanitarnu katastrofu.
Bomba ne pomaže nikom. Nikome ne pomaže bomba.
I consider that the intervention of the West in 1999 against Serbia was made possible by the geostrategic interest that the Western countries might have had, and especially the United States of America.
This had nothing to do with the Albanians or the Americans caring about them.
Da li NATO piloti mogu iz vazduha da razlikuju traktor od tenkova vojske Jugoslavije? Mi se nalazimo na mestu, naravno 10 dana posle poznatog već pokolja koje je NATO izveo gađajući civilnu kolonu izbeglica Šiptara sa Kosmeta.
That's right, NATO killed Albanian civilians too. Lots of them. If they cared about Albanians, or Serbs for that matter, the West wouldn't have aided the KLA, which was directly linked to organized crime and the narcotics trade. You don't help anyone by aiding the mafia. After the highly publicized Rashak massacre, which was later to be revealed by Finnish forensic Helena Ranta as staged, NATO bombed Yugoslavia, but failed to destroy the Yugoslav military.
By the end of NATO bombing, only 13 Yugoslav tanks were destroyed, and a lot of those were old models that were left out deliberately as decoys.
The Serbs had ingenious methods of protecting their military defenses. They built wooden tanks, painted them to look like a real tank, and put an old heater or microwave oven inside it and turned it on. NATO goes by with hyper-high technology, sees the target, bombs it. Okay, those bombs cost several $100,000 per go, and the tar paper tank costs about $200.
Ili u jednom avionu, jedan Englez, jedan Bukarin i jedan Srbin Era. Sad ja ne znam baš kako je to sve išlo po redu, samo na kraju Srbin je bio najpametniji i sve je nadmudrio.
I think I know what movie that is. Is that the one where that man is the father? Oh no, he's a lawyer in that movie I'm thinking of. He's the father of one boy who's one horny little boy that's just going after looking at women all the time and this and that. I watched it. I think I watched all of it. I don't think it was that, but he's the same actor. He's a good actor.
So, why did Slobo give in to NATO?
At the June 2nd meeting, when Marti Ahtisaari and Viktor Černomyrdin came to Belgrade to meet with Milosevic, Ahtisaari read NATO's terms, and Milosevic asked, what will happen then if I don't sign? And there's a table between them with the flower vase, and Ahtisaari moved the vase to the side and said, Belgrade will be like this table. And he repeated the gesture of his arm sweeping across the table. And he said, in a week's time, there'll be 500,000 dead. And we'll be carpet bombing Belgrade.
Faced with Ahtisaari's monstrous threat, Slobo had no choice and signed the agreement, while Ahtisaari went on to win the Nobel Peace Prize in 2008.
Corruption.
This is a CBS News special report, part of our continuing coverage of the crisis over Kosovo.
Earlier today, Serb forces began withdrawing from Kosovo, and NATO suspended its 11-week bombing campaign.
The first step of the Western geostrategic interest was fulfilled in 1999, being that NATO troops entered Kosovo and then remain still in Kosovo.
Along with U.S. troops, which established Camp Bondsteel, their second largest foreign military base outside of Germany, an army of lawyers and consultants was sent into the now occupied Kosovo under World Bank auspices to create an enabling environment for foreign capital. And how was this done?
They set up an organization to manage the privatization of socially owned enterprises. And after a certain period of time, they determined that they would do this without any regard to legal ownership, that they wouldn't have to pay any attention to who actually legally owned this. They just basically confiscated it and privatized it, sold it to whom they chose.
The Yugoslav state banks in Kosovo were closed down and the Deutschmark was adopted as legal tender. Almost the entire banking system in Kosovo was handed over to Germany's Commerzbank AG, which guaranteed full control over commercial banking functions in the province. 1 second though, think about this for a little bit. Human rights violations, war crimes. Those are the reasons the West went into Kosovo, we've been told by the media, right? So why was the head of the UN mission in Kosovo most obsessed with taking over a coal mine from the Serbs? Prior to the bombing...
Same reason why they be going up into Afghanistan and all these other countries.
For the minerals.
Anyway, with that said, we're going to stop this one here. That's the end of part 2 of Jeskonsen Productions. Hvala svima. Catch you on the next one.